Step closer, my friends. There's no need to shy away from the darkness. Allow me to beguile you with some of the strangest stories that have ever graced your attention. But I warn you, these stories are not for the faint of heart. The more cowardly among you may wish to leave now, for one of these stories depicts decapitation. A second sees a faithful soldier made of tin meet a slow, gruesome demise in the flames of a furnace. A third shows a girl step on a loaf of bread to cross a swamp, only to sink into a ceaseless, agonizing purgatory of which you can never truly live, but never truly die. Who conceived of these twisted tales to terrorize the mind, you may ask? Was it Edgar Allan Poe, Bram Stoker, or perhaps H.P. Lovecraft? Not at all, my friend. These stories are none other than the work of Hans Christian Andersen in his classic collection of fairy tales. So that's a bit of a bait and switch, but I promise you, I didn't make any of that up. All of those are actual stories featured here. Welcome to Rose Reads. I'm your host, Hunter Rose, and today we're discussing the many fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen. Now, I usually give a disclaimer that I don't give you the entire story or discuss the intent behind an author's work, but today is going to be a bit different, as we're not discussing one story or a series, rather a compilation of an author's work. So this will be more my general impression of the writings as a whole. But my goal remains the same. All I want to do is help you find out if a book is worth your time, your interest, and what edition you want to get your hands on. Now, you should never judge a book by its cover, but let's take a look at the one I have and see if it's the right edition for you. Although it is pretty dark in here, let me just go hit the lights. I'll be back in a second. Now that's better. Wow. The light can make a big difference. Anywho, this is the Barnes & Noble collectible edition of the Fairy Tales of Hans Christian Andersen. So how many fairy tales are actually included? You might think a couple dozen at most, but there's actually 100 different fairy tales in this one book. For $25, you get 100 short stories in a single volume. That's definitely a good bargain. As for the material of the hardcover, it's actually quite sound and sturdy, and the design is appealing. The color palette is pleasant, and the design is entirely based on one of Andersen's most profound stories, The Nightingale. You can see an illustration of the bird on the cover, the spine, and the back. And this will definitely look good anywhere you have it in your home. So let's recap. It's a great value, plenty of content, quality material, and an appealing design. This book checks all of its bases, and it's definitely a smart purchase. But don't go reaching for your wallet just yet. Let's have a heart-to-heart about the actual content before you make a firm decision. Let's start with the name, Hans Christian Andersen. If that sounds familiar to you, you probably recognize him as the author of The Little Mermaid, which is by far his most popular and, as cliche as it sounds, best work. But it's not his only famous story. He's also written The Emperor's New Clothes, The Princess and the Pea, The Ugly Duckling, and Thumbelina. And you probably have at least a passing knowledge of those fairy tales. But those are only a handful of what I already said are 100. So what gives with that? Well, if we look at the Barnes & Noble collectible editions, they actually have two major compilations of fairy tales available. The ones we're talking about today, and the Brothers Grimm. I get the impression that the Brothers Grimm stories are far more recognizable and relevant today than Andersen's, as many of his stories take a surreal approach that prevents them from coming to the mainstream. I mean, a few are centered entirely on inanimate objects, like plants and furniture. Whether you're age 5 or 55, you're bound to find those just a little bizarre. But what else can be said? Well, Andersen was a very patriotic man. A couple of these fairy tales are just pieces on how great the history and people of Denmark are. So you've got that to look forward to. And Andersen is also a very Christian man. Many of these stories has heavy religious themes and imagery. His religious devotion might actually explain why his stories vary so heavily in tone, as especially for the time, the faith was centered on both a love of God and a fear of damnation, two powerful polar opposite emotions coexisting on a single subject. And that right there is the key word, emotion. Many authors try to do many different things, and there's no doubt in my mind, Andersen wants to make you feel more than anything. Some of these stories will have you awed at how beautifully they're written. Some will have you laughing out loud. Others will have you holding back tears, and some are just flat out disturbing. This is, for lack of a better word, the literary equivalent of Russian roulette. Each story is going to make you feel something, and it's going to hit you hard. You just never know what it's going to be. And I won't deny, I've never seen an author like Andersen before. The way he writes is gorgeous. There's something incredibly whimsical and flowery about these stories. Each one feels akin to poetry without conforming to any specific rhythm structure. But that's what makes each dark twist and turn so jarring. There's a massive disconnect between how he writes and what he actually wants to write about. I need an example. Take Stephen King. He cultivated his writing style to complement the exploration of dark themes and subjects. And you're there because you want to dive into those kinds of stories. This feels like taking your kid to see a My Little Pony movie, only for the dark twist is that all the horses get slaughtered at the end. I don't care who you are or what the rest of the movie was. That's just bound to make anyone uncomfortable. Now, I do want to talk about a couple of the individual stories here. The first of which is one of my favorites, The Little Mermaid. The Little Mermaid, both as a book and an animation, is one of my favorite pieces of media of all time. I may have a slight bias, as I've actually played the character of Prince Eric in live productions of The Little Mermaid twice now. But even that experience aside, there really is something about this story that I do adore. Let's do a bit of compare and contrast. As far as plot goes, the two are almost identical. They center around a little mermaid that's curious about the world above the waves, and after saving a prince from drowning, she becomes infatuated with him. It's those feelings that gives her the determination to seek out a sea witch and trade her voice for a pair of legs. And she leaves everything she knows behind to go explore a brand new world for the very first time. And the rest is happily ever after. Or in one case, just ever after. Where the two really diverge is in its goal. Disney's Little Mermaid is a feel-good animated feature for the whole family to enjoy. Andersen's book, in its core, is a tragedy. I hope there was never an instance where a family took their kid to see The Little Mermaid, then immediately got them the book without reading it for themselves first, as Andersen's Little Mermaid can be a little more than aggressive. Let's take The Little Mermaid's deal with the Sea Witch, for example. In the movie, Ursula takes Ariel's voice via magic as the down payment for her legs. It's implied that it can simply be undone once Ariel holds up to her end of the bargain. The book's not so clean, as the Sea Witch in the book actually cuts the Little Mermaid's tongue right out of her head, rendering her dumb for life. Yeah, no amount of mermaid magic or songs from Sebastian is going to be making that better. Worse still, because her new legs are alien to her physiology, Every single step she takes on land, no matter what she's stepping on, feels like she's stepping on dozens of shards of broken glass. And wait, there's more. Much like the animation, the spell has a time limit. So the Little Mermaid only has a short window of opportunity to seal the deal with true love's kiss, or all of her efforts would be for nothing. It is tremendous how much pain and suffering the Little Mermaid actually goes through. I mean, it's almost absurd. I'm not even really sure where I can go after saying all that. Let's touch on the Little Mermaid's triumph as a tragedy. As I alluded to before, a lot of Anderson's darker twists can feel abrupt. Like they come out of the blue or can really be attacked on and then they died at the end. They serve their purpose, but can feel a little dissatisfying. What makes The Little Mermaid special in this regard is that it's not like that at all. It's structured so that nothing just blindsides you. There's a genuine sense of buildup that culminates in a climax that makes the whole tragic experience actually rewarding. And what really adds to that tragic experience is that there's no antagonist. I know that sounds odd for me to say, given the atrocious things I already told you that the Sea Witch does, but hear me out. In the movie, Ursula deliberately manipulates Ariel in the hope of using her to extort her father, and even goes as far as to rig their arrangement in her favor. The Sea Witch in the book isn't like that. She doesn't trick or force the Little Mermaid into anything, and she doesn't even have an ulterior motive. All she does is name a price, a heavy one, but one the Little Mermaid was willing to pay in her pursuit of happiness. And that idea is so interesting to me. The fact there's no evil involved, it's all just conflicting desires. The Little Mermaid wants to explore brand new places and be with her prince. Her family just wants to keep her sheltered and safe. The Sea Witch just wants to practice her craft, and the prince wants... I don't want to give too much away from this book. I think I'll let you figure out the rest of the book's ending on your own. But the point I'm trying to make is that despite being a story about a girl from under the sea, there is something undeniably human about its narrative. And fairy tale or not, The Little Mermaid on its own, definitely worth taking a look at. Now, there is one other individual story I would like to touch on before we go. What's really curious to me here is less of the story itself, but actually what it went on to inspire. And let's get into that. The next story we're going to talk about is The Snow Queen. It's one of Anderson's more well-known. How that happened, I'm not quite sure. You see, a lot of Anderson's stories tend to read like fever dreams, and The Snow Queen is hands down one of his trippiest, man. I don't even know. Like, okay, I usually only loosely touch on a story's plot in the hopes of enticing you to read the book for yourself. But I am going to take the time to walk you through the plot of The Snow Queen just so you can appreciate how weird this really is. All right, let's get ready. Here we go. So our story opens with the Devil's Mirror. Yeah, you know when you open a book and the first thing you read about is a piece from Satan's interior decorating? You're in for a real treat. Anyway, a bunch of little demons take this mirror and fly around and show it to humans so that they can only see the worst in themselves. I think if I was confronted with literal demons from hell, low self-esteem would be the least of my issues, but I digress. Anyway, these little demons fly high above the sky, and the mirror shatters, raining shards of the mirror across the globe into people's hearts and eyes, so they can only see the world as cruel and vindictive. To be honest, aside from like a little bit at the end, the whole Devil's Mirror thing is basically ignored for the rest of the story, so I guess we'll just ignore it too. The real story pertains to two best friends, one little boy, one little girl. And one evening, while the little boy was out sledding, the Snow Queen swoops down and snatches the child and whisks him away to her ice castle, ice fortress, ice house? Anyway, she plops the kid down in her icy cold residence and says, hey, sport, if you solve this puzzle for me, I'll make you my ward and teach you my ice magic. Does that sound good, champ? Great. Well, I'll just leave you to it then. And the rest of the book follows the little girl as she travels far and wide across the land, meeting a cast of colorful characters and talking animals in the hopes of finding her lost friend. And when the little girl finally gets to the Snow Queen's castle, the Snow Queen's gone. And I kid you not, the explanation is that the Snow Queen was staying over at a friend's place when the little girl gets there. So there's no final confrontation. The little girl doesn't have to convince the Snow Queen to let her friend go, or the two kids kill the Ice Witch, or anything like that. She just walks in, the boy's the only one there, and she goes, hey, buddy, I've been looking everywhere for you. Come on, you silly Billy, let's get you home. And they go home, and that's it. What happens to the Snow Queen? I don't know. I assume she goes on to steal more kids. I mean, who's to say this hasn't happened 3 or 4 more times before this? Safe to say, I don't get the Snow Queen. But clearly, a lot of writers did see some value in this. Because if you remember the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe took some inspiration from this, given the White Witch and talking animals. And even more interestingly, Disney's Frozen is very, 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 very loosely adapted from the Snow Queen. Yeah, I can't wait to see Disney's Slip, a story that's loosely based on Andersen's tale of the enchanted slippers that grant the wearers every wish, and they end up sending a man to the moon. Now that I say that out loud, that is entirely feasible. And before you ask, yeah, Andersen wrote a story like that, and yes, they send a man to the moon. I know I've spent a lot of time really tearing into this material, so I'm just going to hit you with my honest feelings. I did not enjoy my time with this book. I expected to put my feet up and unwind with some inconsequential fairy tale fluff pieces, but while my feet were up, Andersen grabbed me by the ankles and dragged me kicking and screaming to places I had no intention of going. But if you want to test your emotional endurance, if the idea of that anticipation of not knowing what you're going to get every page entices you, I will say you won't find an experience like this anywhere else. My personal feelings aside, I do think a few of these works really are worth reading for yourself. So here's my personal recommendation. Get out a pencil and notepad. You're going to want to jot this down. Barnes & Noble makes smaller, more concise collectible editions based on Andersen's work, one of which focuses solely on The Little Mermaid, plus it includes some of his more popular stories. That is the best way you can go. That way you get your hands on a nice looking book, you get the magnum opus, which is The Little Mermaid, and you don't put yourself through the strife of reading all of these stories. Those are my words of wisdom. What you do next is entirely up to you. But before you make your big decision, let me know what you think in the comments below. Are you willing to put yourself through the ringer that is Andersen's fairy tales? And if you're already knowledgeable about any of his stories, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, I don't actually have permission to be in this library at this hour, so I better be on my way. But oh, if anyone asks why some of the more valuable books are missing, well, I was never here. I'll see you in the next video.